A free community, 200 years, a name they chose themselves, Moors. In the sandy pine flats of Kent County, Delaware, they were never enslaved. They owned land, generation after generation, and they told a single story about where they came from. Shipwrecked North African sailors, married to native women along the coast in the 1600s. They defended that story in court. They built their identity on it. Now, DNA has revealed a documented ancestry far more complex than the legend alone ever suggested. The heart of this community lay in the sandy pine flats of central Delaware, a landscape of low ridges and slow creeks that resisted the plantation agriculture of the coast. Their primary settlement clustered around the crossroads village of Cheswold in Kent County, a place so identified with them that outsiders often called them the Cheswold Moors. In legal records, they sometimes appeared as Nanticoke Moors, a name that hinted at deeper indigenous ties. From Cheswold, family networks radiated south into Sussex County, where related households held farms along the Nanticoke River watershed. The surnames repeated across the county line: Durham, Ridgeway, Coker, Sockum, marking a dispersed but tightly woven kinship web. The land itself was marginal, the sort of scrubby pine barrens that colonial planters had little use for, and that very marginality helped these families maintain both their property and their separateness for generations. The map did not stop at the state line. Across the border in Worcester County, Maryland, another community carried the Moor designation, connected by marriage and migration to the Delaware families. They were not identical communities, but they shared a common social position, free, landowning, and insistent on an identity that fit neither white nor black categories. This corner of the Delmarva Peninsula, roughly between the Choptank and Pocomoke rivers, became their historic ground, a place where a distinct people could endure. For as long as anyone could remember, the families of the Cheswold Pine Flats carried a story about where they came from. It was not a story of the Middle Passage or the plantation. It began with a shipwreck. Sometime in the late 1600s or early 1700s, so the telling went, a vessel foundered off the Delaware coast. Those who survived were dark-skinned men, not Africans, but Moors, or perhaps Spaniards. They had sailed from North Africa, or some said from the Spanish Main. Once ashore, these shipwrecked sailors moved inland, into the forests and marshes of the Delmarva Peninsula. There they encountered Native American women, likely of the Nanticoke or Lenape bands who still ranged through that country. They married, raised children, and those children became the first of the people who would call themselves Moors. The story was remarkably consistent across generations and family lines. By the mid-19th century, folklorists and local historians began recording it in the words of the community's own elders. The narrative served a powerful purpose. It explained how a free, landowning people of color could exist in a region where African ancestry was so often equated with bondage. A shipwreck meant an origin outside the colonial slave system. Moorish or Spanish blood suggested a lineage that was neither white nor Negro in the legal sense. This was not a legend borrowed from neighboring tri-racial groups. It was distinct, internally coherent, and held with conviction. The Delaware Moors used it to assert their free status, to resist classification as colored under tightening racial laws, and to claim a place apart. For 2 centuries, the shipwreck story was their founding truth, a story that placed their beginnings beyond the reach of slavery's grasp. But the paper trail tells a different story, one written in tax rolls and land deeds, not legend. By the 1740s, the names Durham, Ridgeway, Coker, and Sockum appear in Kent County, Delaware, tax records. They are listed as free persons of color, owning land, paying taxes, building lives. Similar entries surface across the line in Sussex County and Worcester County, Maryland. Families with surnames like Dean, Hansor, Morgan, and Seeney, all recorded as free, all present in the same pine flats the Moors would call home. These were not isolated entries. Genealogical research has now traced several of these lines back further, into the late 1600s. In the 1680s, colonial court records in Delaware and Maryland document free black and mixed heritage individuals completing indentures, receiving freedom dues, and sometimes acquiring land. They were part of a small but real population of free people of color in the Chesapeake, emerging in the decades before slavery hardened into a lifelong, hereditary institution. Some were the children of European indentured servants and African partners. Others descended from enslaved people manumitted in the 17th century. Their freedom was fragile, but it was documented, and it predated the shipwreck legend by generations. The Durham family line, for instance, can be reliably traced to a free black man named John Durham, recorded in Somerset County, Maryland, as early as 1685. The Ridgeways appear in Delaware land transactions by the 1720s. These families intermarried, moved across county lines, and formed the nucleus of the community that would later claim Moorish identity. The paper record does not speak of shipwrecked sailors. It speaks of free people navigating an increasingly hostile racial landscape, using every legal tool available to hold on to land and status. But the story of the Delaware Moors is not confined to paper records and tax lists. It is deeply intertwined with the land itself and its original peoples. Their homeland lies within the historical territories of the Nanticoke and Lenape nations. Throughout the colonial period on the Delmarva Peninsula, documented intermarriage occurred between free people of African descent, European settlers, and native families. This created a complex web of kinship. The neighboring Nanticoke Indian community of Delaware shares documented historical and, in some specific family lines, direct genealogical connections to the same Cheswold area families who were known as Moors. This Native American thread is a vital component of their tri-racial heritage, woven into the community long before modern genetics could confirm it. The founding legend spoke of unions with native women along the coast, and in this, the oral tradition reflects a profound historical truth. The connections were real, sustained, and integral to the formation of a distinct people in the Pine Flats. The genetic record, assembled from direct descendants of the Cheswold and Sussex County families, tells a story that is both confirming and complicating. Across multiple testing platforms, a consistent tri-racial signature emerges. European ancestry, largely from the British Isles, accounts for the largest fraction, often between 50 and 60%. Sub-Saharan African ancestry, drawn from populations along the West African coast, contributes roughly a quarter to a third of the genetic profile. And Native American markers, consistent with the Algonquian-speaking peoples of the Delmarva Peninsula, appear in measurable, statistically significant proportions, typically in the range of 1 to 5%. What the DNA does not show is equally telling. Across hundreds of individual samples from families with surnames like Durham, Ridgeway, and Coker, no distinct North African or Iberian haplogroups appear. There is no genetic thread tying these lines to the Maghreb, to Andalusia, or to any specific Moorish population of the Mediterranean. The European component is overwhelmingly Northwest European. The African component is overwhelmingly West African. The native component is overwhelmingly local. The shipwrecked Moorish sailor, as a literal founding ancestor, leaves no trace in the blood. But the deeper architecture of the community's self-understanding, that they were a people of blended origins, neither one thing nor another in the rigid categories of the American racial order, is written into every strand of DNA. The genes do not lie about the mixing. They only correct the geography of the legend. The name Moor was far more than a story. It was a legal strategy. In the rigid racial hierarchy of colonial and early America, to be classified simply as Negro could mean the loss of fundamental rights, the right to vote, to serve in the militia, to attend public schools, or to marry whom you chose. Historians studying the Delmarva Peninsula see the adoption of Moor as a deliberate, self-chosen identity for these free families of mixed ancestry. It placed them in a recognized, if ambiguous, third category, distinct from both white and Negro. This was not merely a genealogical claim, but a social and legal one, with profound, everyday consequences. The community defended this designation for generations, sometimes in court, to secure their place and protect their hard-won freedoms. Their fight was for the right to exist outside a binary system, a right they anchored in a powerful, enduring origin story. In 1881, a Kent County school commissioner ordered that the children of Cheswold's Moor families be sent to the local colored school. The families refused. They argued in court that their community was neither white nor Negro under Delaware law, but a distinct people with its own standing. The case set a precedent that would echo for decades. By the early 20th century, the Cheswold Moors had built and maintained their own one-room school, known simply as the Moor School. It stood on land donated by a community member, funded by their own taxes, and staffed by a teacher from within their ranks. When county officials again tried to force its closure in the 1920s, parents filed suit. They pointed to the state's own tangled racial statutes, which made no clear provision for a people who had always been free and had never fit the legal definition of colored. In several instances, Delaware courts sided with the families, allowing the separate Moor School to continue operating. These legal battles were not isolated. Similar fights erupted in Sussex County and across the Maryland line, where related families pressed for their own schools. The stakes were existential. To accept classification as colored meant surrendering a hard-won identity and the fragile privileges it carried, the right to send children to a school that honored their heritage rather than one that erased it. The community's persistence in court, often with little money and no formal legal training, revealed how deeply they understood the power of a name. Their claim to Moor identity was not merely a legend, it was a shield, wielded in county courthouses and school board hearings, generation after generation. When the genetic results began to circulate among Delaware Moor families in the early 21st century, the findings were precise. No detectable North African or Iberian markers appeared in the DNA. The triracial signature, European, Sub-Saharan African, Native American, was unmistakable. But the shipwrecked Moorish sailor of oral tradition left no molecular trace. For some descendants, the science landed as a quiet rupture. The founding story had been carried across 10 generations, told beside wood stoves in Cheswold kitchens, recorded by folklorists in the 1890s, repeated in court affidavits defending segregated Moor schools. To learn it was not literally true, felt, for a time, like losing a compass. But for many others, the genetic record illuminated a deeper inheritance. The DNA did not erase the ancestors, it revealed them in full complexity. The free black and mixed heritage families who appeared in Kent County tax rolls by the 1740s, the native women whose names rarely survived the colonial record, the European indentured servants who slipped into free communities of color, these were the people whose blood endured. Their descendants had not simply inherited a romance of shipwreck, they had inherited a 2-century legal and social campaign to remain free, to remain distinct, to remain Moors. In that light, the absence of a North African genetic signal became almost incidental. What the community had built, a self-defined identity defended in school board hearings and county courthouses, passed from one generation to the next against the weight of American racial law, was not contingent on a single origin story. It was the product of an unrelenting collective will. The true inheritance was not a ship's manifest, but the courage to insist on one's own name. For 200 years, the Delaware Moors fought a quiet, relentless battle to be seen as something other than white or Negro. This struggle was never solely about literal North African ancestry. It was about the fundamental right to self-definition. The legend of shipwrecked sailors provided a powerful origin story, a shield against a world demanding rigid classification. But the deeper truth, now clarified by documents and DNA, is that their identity was a conscious creation. It was a legal and social stance, asserted in land deeds, defended in courtrooms over school segregation, and maintained in the face of mounting racial pressure. The name Moor was a declaration of independence long before it was a genealogical hypothesis. This self-chosen label carried real weight, determining access to schools, voting rights, and community standing. The genetic record confirms a tri-racial heritage of European, African, and Native American ancestry, a testament to the complex colonial history of the Delmarva Peninsula. Yet it finds no distinct Moorish signature. The revelation is not that the legend was false, but that the truth is more profound. Their identity was not a passive inheritance from distant sailors, but an active, enduring achievement, the product of an unrelenting collective will. What the records reveal, together, is a story larger than any single origin myth. The oral tradition preserved a community's sense of itself. The land deeds and tax rolls proved its continuous free presence. The DNA mapped a tri-racial inheritance that no shipwreck tale could fully contain. Each strand of evidence corrects, deepens, and amplifies the others. The genetic markers do not show a North African arrival, but they do show something rarer, a population that kept itself distinct through centuries of legal pressure, marrying within a network of families that stretched from the Nanticoke watershed to the Pine Barrens of Sussex County. The name Moor was never a misremembered passport. It was a chosen boundary, a legal shield, and a declaration that this community would not be collapsed into categories it had never inhabited. The fight over schools, the court petitions, the insistence on separate classification, these were not footnotes to a legend. They were its living consequence. The DNA findings do not diminish that struggle. They give it a new kind of precision. We can now see the full architecture of an identity that was built from European, African, and native threads, then defended with a single word for 200 years. The ship may never have wrecked on the Delaware coast, but the community survived its own long storm, and the record now holds that survival in sharper focus than any founding story could offer. What remains is not a correction, but a completion. The truth was always larger than the telling. Now, at last, the telling can match it.